Good morning, everybody. My name is Kia Booker. I'm with Entitlement Communities Division, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about economic development, along with my colleague, Mr. Jorge Morales. Next slide, please. We're going to start with a little housekeeping. PowerPoint presentations and webinar recording will be available on the HUD Exchange after the conference. Today, participants will be in listen-only mode. Closed caption can be viewed using the show captions feature below the video player. You may consult the attendee guide for more information available on the resources page of the event website. Next slide. You have the ability to submit content-related questions using the Q&A feature located below the video player. You may need to scroll down the webpage to view the Q&A. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to submit. You have the ability to upvote on questions by clicking on your like button. This will move some questions to the top of the queue that are very popular. You do not have to use that option, but it is available for you. For technical issues, request assistance through the chat box on the right side of your screen. Additionally, questions related to technical issues can be emailed to eventsupport@cdbgcv.com. To answer poll questions using the polls tab, it's located below the video player. You may need to scroll down the web page to view poll questions. Next. If you would like to access questions or polls while simultaneously viewing the event, download the Slido app on your phone in your web browser, or go to Slido in your web browser, then type in the code for this session. The support team is posting the Slido code for this session in your chat. You can scroll to the bottom of the page to find the Slido code in the session description. Now, housekeeping completed. Welcome to economic development. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'm happy to be able to share with you today a little bit, just a little bit that I know about the topic. Will you please move to the next slide, please? So today we're going to be starting out with the eligible economic development activities that can be supported with CDBG and CDBG-CV funds. And please also note the regulation where you can read more about each. But the first is special economic development activities. There are 3 categories of special economic development activities that I'll discuss in detail on the next slide. But in the meantime, you might want to know what makes them special. The use of the term special is twofold. It is used to distinguish it from other CDBG activities, most of which in very broad terms can be thought of as economic development. So what is economic development? Under the umbrella of economic development, we think of all activities that aim to sustain or increase business activity. Coming from an economic development agency where I worked for many years, when I hear economic development, my mind immediately goes to job creation and retention. I had those concepts drilled into me for a very long time. Absolutely everything we did had to create or retain jobs. Economic development is that, but it's so much more. It can include improvements to public infrastructure for the purposes of business attraction or retention. Under the umbrella of economic development, CDBG also includes public services concerned with employment, access to capital, and credit development activities that promote long-term economic viability in communities. Empowerment and self-sufficiency opportunities for low-income persons to reduce generational poverty, in federally assisted and public housing. This is not a comprehensive list, but all these things fall under the umbrella of economic development. I'll go into what is special economic development in detail in later slides. But getting back to our list of eligible activities, the next is microenterprise activities, which is one of my personal favorites. And I'll be covering that in later slides as well. My colleague Jorge will be picking up when we begin taking a look at the next eligible activities, which are commercial rehabilitation, job training, technical assistance to businesses, and community-based development organizations. These are also known as CDBOs. And I'll note here that CDBOs are not an activity, but a delivery mechanism for economic development activities. And Jorge will cover that as well. Next slide, please. For now, let's take a look at special economic development activities. So what is special economic development? Well, CDBG uses the term special economic development as the three types of activities described on your slide. And please take note of the corresponding regulation where you can read more about each. So as a consequence of changes to CDBG's program legislation in 1992, significant changes were made to the regs to facilitate the use of CDBG funds specifically for economic development. So the program became more flexible in its regulations, and economic development activities as defined by CDBG expanded to include the three categories that you see in front of you. What remains the same is that all economic development activities, whether traditional or special, must all still meet a national objective. And you're going to hear that over and over again if you haven't already through this week. So the first type of special economic development activity is the acquisition, construction, rehabilitation, reconstruction, or installation of commercial, industrial buildings or equipment. I know that was a mouthful. The thing to know here is that this work can only be done by a recipient or subrecipient. An example of this might be the construction of a business incubator. For anyone that is unfamiliar, business incubators help and grow young businesses and entrepreneurs by providing low-cost shared office space and other supports, such as financial, administrative, and technical services. Some offer mentoring and coaching as well. Business incubators help create and or retain jobs, but can also address the effects of job loss in communities, which makes them really good activity choices for place-based economic development. The second type is assistance to private for-profit businesses. This is deemed an eligible activity if it is necessary to carry out an economic development project. This includes, but isn't limited to, issuing grants, loans, loan guarantees, interest supplements, technical assistance, and other forms of support. This does not include activities described as ineligible. And we learned what they are in a previous session, so I won't go into any detail, but I'll quickly mention them. Buildings can't be built for the general conduct of government. CDBG funds cannot be used to cover general government expenses or to engage in political activities. But getting back to assistance to for-profit businesses, a key factor to consider when providing this form of assistance is that you want to minimize as much as possible the displacement of existing businesses and jobs in the neighborhood. Most of the assistance provided is in the form of a loan. The borrower typically has to meet a national objective by a particular time frame that's identified by the grantee, or the project will be in non-compliance. The grantee should specify with the business a period of performance for meeting the national objective and eligible activities in the loan agreement. So it should be specified in the loan agreement. So what is a good example of this kind of assistance? It might be a loan to pay for the expansion of a factory or commercial business. What does expansion mean for that community? It means the creation of new jobs because a larger facility doing additional work will hopefully create a need for additional labor. The final economic development activity classified as special is economic development services in connection with special economic development activities. This is a huge one in CDBG. I literally saw the need for this assistance increase 1,000-fold due to the coronavirus pandemic. CDBG eligible economic development services include outreach efforts to market available forms of assistance, the screening of applicants, the review and underwriting of applications for assistance, preparation of all necessary agreements, management of assisted activities, and the screening, referral, and placement of applicants for employment opportunities generated by CDBG eligible economic development activities, which include the cost of providing necessary training for persons filling those positions. There was such a great need for marketing available forms of assistance, particularly working capital assistance for businesses that suffered due to the shutdown. So when the pandemic hit, screening of applicants had to be done to qualify possible recipients for that funding. Their applications had to be reviewed and underwritten. Some businesses and their staff became unemployed when businesses closed their doors forever. But communities benefited by being able to learn new skills and train for new positions because of CDBG funds for economic development services. They were and are really, really impactful. Another activity that can be supported under this category during a pandemic or at any other time is providing technical assistance to a business facing bankruptcy. I saw this type of assistance provided for many restaurants, hair salons, retail stores, etc., especially during the pandemic, but the need is there even during non-pandemic times. By providing this support, you will help retain existing jobs and also save a community from losing needed goods and services. Next slide, please. Special economic development offers flexibility in the types of assistance that can be provided to a nonprofit or for-profit business. So the key word here is flexibility. That's one of the reasons CDBG is so attractive to grantees. Grants, loans, and loan guarantees are three types of assistance available to a nonprofit or for-profit business. Grants, of course, do not have to be paid back, but loans typically do. There is a such thing as a forgivable loan, where a borrower must complete certain activities, and if all conditions are satisfied, then the loan doesn't have to be repaid. It essentially becomes a grant. But if activities are not completed and conditions are not met, the loan does have to be repaid. A loan guarantee is when a third party, in this case HUD CDBG, guarantees or assumes the debt obligation in the event that the borrower defaults. And lastly, technical assistance and support services help to build capacity. It should be noted that if more than one national objective can apply to an activity, grantees are most likely going to choose the national objective that requires the least amount of record keeping. In particular, in regard to meeting a public benefit. However, 57% of commercial industrial projects and 96% financial assistance to for-profits use the low-mod jobs or LMJ category, which is actually not the easiest to document. Next slide, please. So we're moving into CDBG-CV, which doesn't differ very much from CDBG as far as economic development is concerned. However, the biggest and most important difference is PPR. All CDBG-CV economic development activities must prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus. It is essential that you be able to show that link. It is likely that most CDBG-CV economic development activities will be funded under special economic development and the micro enterprise assistance categories. So how can CDBG be used to support for-profit businesses? Here are just a few ways. They can help prevent job loss caused by closures related to public health recommendations. So that would include the lockdown that we all experienced. They can be used to establish or expand businesses, to create jobs, to provide medical supplies, and other goods and services for infectious disease response. They can be used to convert manufacturing operations to produce medical supplies and other products for infectious disease response while creating or retaining jobs. They can be used to give grants, loans, and loan guarantees to small business owners. And I think this is the use that I have seen the most of during this pandemic. Next slide, please. So on April 30th, 2021, guidance was issued on CDBG-CV approaches with PPR tieback. Additional activities identified here that may address coronavirus include providing working capital to enable job creation retention. Again, this is what I've seen the most of. The ability to access working capital during the corona pandemic is and was crucial. With our economy having taken a hit immediately after the pandemic struck, it was a matter of survival for businesses to be able to have liquidity to cover working capital expenses when their ability to generate business income had been drastically diminished. Again, think about your hotels that were no longer able to serve customers, fitness centers that could no longer open their doors to clients, real estate brokers that were no longer able to show homes. Those businesses still had working capital expenses. That's where working capital can help keep that business in operation and retain its employees. In other instances, some businesses had to make a real pivot in order to create and or retain jobs. Working capital assistance could be used to retrofit a sit-down indoor restaurant to turn it into a restaurant that sells pre-made meals for pickup or delivery. A working capital loan could be used to purchase delivery trucks to deliver meals or to purchase protective plexiglass barriers to place between customers picking up orders and employees that are fulfilling those orders. For some restaurants, these were their only options for continuing to operate and retain staff. Provide grants or loans to support entrepreneurs or existing businesses to acquire, convert, construct, or reconstruct commercial spaces to revitalize communities and local economies affected by business or job losses resulting from the coronavirus. I know that was another mouthful, but that is the second use. Again, sticking with the restaurant industry, because that was the one that I saw most often. Many restaurants that previously only had indoor seating now had to adjust to serving sit-down meals outdoors in order to stay in business. In many cases, new tables, new chairs, plexiglass barriers, outdoor heaters, masks for employees, hand sanitizer stations, and more had to be purchased in order for restaurateurs to be able to abide by the new rules. Grants and loans were needed to support those entrepreneurs in helping them to become compliant This is just one other appropriate and good use of CDBG-CV funds used to prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus. And in this case, it was to respond to coronavirus. Next slide, please. So the next use, avoid or reverse job loss of positions or hours worked caused by business closures related to community mitigation measures. And I won't read the entire slide to you, it's in front of you. I'll just say this use looks very similar to the first use of funds that we talked about on the slide, which addresses job creation and retention. However, this use of funds specifically looks at how to reverse job loss. I can't tell you how critical working capital assistance is to address reversing job loss. Due to the pandemic having caused all of us to have to socially isolate for so long, many front-facing, service-oriented businesses were forced to close their doors or reduce services significantly. This affected restaurants, retail stores, hair salons, day spas, daycare centers, real estate agencies, movie theaters. I can go on and on. The loss of income often led to temporary, but in many cases, permanent layoffs of existing staff. Working capital loans can and have been used to address this. A working capital loan could allow for a business to call back laid off workers. And that reduces the chance of that business losing that position forever. A grantee may choose to assist a startup business or to restart businesses that closed since January 2020 to offset business closures due to the economic effects of the coronavirus. Next slide, please. So now moving into microenterprise assistance. Microenterprise, taking a look at your slide, is defined as owners or persons who work toward developing, expanding, or stabilizing a business. It's a commercial enterprise with 5 or less employees, including the owner. Now, SBA's definition is slightly different. SBA defines a microenterprise as having no more than 4 employees, including the owner. CDBG, no more than 5 employees, including the owner. And they may provide assistance as loans, grants, and other forms of financial support. Microenterprises became popular in the developing world because lenders could make small loans for things like taxis or sewing machines, which would immediately create business and employment. I actually didn't learn that until I was preparing for this presentation, but it's very interesting. Then the entrepreneur could gradually grow based on the initial success. Now I'm going to expound on this definition that's in our slide with one that I think. Microenterprise is a sole proprietorship, partnership, limited liability corporation, or corporation that has fewer than 5 employees, including the owner. But I'll add that it generally lacks access to conventional loans, equity, or other banking services. Now, the reasons for the lack of access can vary. Some, but not all, microenterprises may have challenges with creditworthiness, tax filings, inaccurate or missing financial statements. Some microenterprises may not have been in operation very long, less than 3 years or even less than 1 year. They might struggle with the lack of formal financial education or simply not know how to access capital. And that's where you all come in, because with CDBG, you can help them gain access. CDBG can be utilized to provide assistance as loans, grants, and much needed technical assistance and other forms of financial support. Next slide, please. When I talked about some of the unique challenges of microenterprises in the previous slide, this is where using CDBG to provide technical assistance and business services to microenterprise owners can help fill some of those chasms. Technical assistance can be provided to teach entrepreneurs how to accurately complete financial statements and track spending, bookkeeping, marketing strategies, etc. Note that under the subcategory of general support, CDBG funds may be used to provide services of any kind that may be needed by the owner of or a person developing a microenterprise to enable the establishment, stabilization, or expansion of the business. This could include childcare, transportation, counseling, and peer support programs. These are things that we probably haven't given a lot of thought to, but are necessary for microenterprises to succeed. Something that you do need to know, any such services provided under this authority are not subject to the cap on public services, regardless of the entity providing the service. It should also be noted that financially or technically assisting a microenterprise may also be carried out under the basic eligibility categories of special economic development activities and special activities by CDBOs. However, if carried out under either of those categories, such assistance will be subject to the requirements concerning public benefit. And Jorge is going to discuss those requirements a little later. Next slide, please. So we talked about funding TA and training to increase capacity in previous slides. I think what is important to note here is that there is no limit in the amount or type of CDBG loan or grant given to each microenterprise. So there is room for a lot of flexibility in the assistance that you provide. These activities are not subject to public benefit standards, which Jorge is going to discuss a little later. And this is important. The owner is not required to be LMI, low moderate income, but the activities must still meet a national objective. I know we sound like a broken record here, but all CDBG activities must meet a national objective. Next slide, please. CDBG-CV funds may be used to establish, stabilize, and expand microenterprises that provide medical, food delivery, cleaning, and other services to support home health and quarantine. Assistance may be provided via loans, technical assistance, grants, and other financial assistance. May provide technical assistance, grants, loans, and other financial assistance to establish, stabilize, and expand microenterprises, to revitalize communities and local economies affected by coronavirus, or to prepare for and prevent future outbreaks. And I'll just note here that the last bullet is found in the April 30th, 2021 CDBG-CV tieback flexibilities guidance as an eligible activity. Thank you for your time, everybody. We're going to pause for a moment to field any questions. And after that, I'm going to pass control over to my colleague, Jorge, who will take it from here. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kia. There's a question on the chat.
Yes, I'm looking at it now. For the microenterprise, does the owners need to be low moderate income? The answer to that is no. We talked about that. Question probably came in before I got to that point. So.
Awesome.
I'm not sure if my answer was heard. I'm going to repeat that. The owners do not need to be low mod income. We did talk a little bit about that. This question was probably submitted prior. And that is actually the only question that I see. So I'm going to pass over control to Jorge, who's going to talk to us about commercial rehabilitation.
Awesome. Thank you, Kia. Good morning, everyone. Let's talk about commercial rehabilitation as an activity. This commercial rehabilitation category may include the following activities: acquisition, construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, or installation of commercial or industrial buildings, structures, and other real property, equipment, and improvements. These are not subject to public benefit standards if carried out under 570-202, which is the rehabilitation provisions. These activities are designed mainly to bring commercial structures up to code or to improve their facades. If the commercial structure is owned by a private for-profit entity, the following limitations apply. Rehabilitation, like I mentioned before, is limited to the exterior of the building and the correction of code violations. And any other improvements are carried out under the special conditions, special economic development activities category discussed above. So if they are beyond the facade and code violations, then they can't use the for-profit cannot use the 202. They will have to go to the special economic development activities under 570-203. So, like I mentioned, this activity, commercial rehabilitation, may only be carried out by recipients or public-private nonprofit sub-recipients, with exception of the facade and code violation, like I mentioned, which are under 203. But in this case, they are eligible under the provisions of 570-202, and just a quick brief description of those provisions. Specifically, 202A1 specifies more residential focused and will be specific to businesses owners that use their residents for their place of business, and where any improvement could be viewed as benefiting their residents. Then the 202A3 is public and private owned commercial buildings. About private owned buildings, rehab is limited to the exterior work and lead abatement. That's where we have the restriction on the type of assistance that a private owner can have. Then you have the 202A4, which is more specific to a nonprofit. So using this activity category, several communities have established facade improvement programs with CDBG money, with different variations and scope in accordance with their needs. There's some ones that use this activity for-profit businesses, very limited facade improvements when they have like a big development project in their communities. Others go more deeply than that, but it's very interesting the flexibility on using this activity. Next slide, please. So as an example, on job training is essential to developing the human capital, as you will know, in an area or community that prepares the residents and citizens of that target area for gainful employment. So this is very, very important. Some examples of different jobs training program includes job search assistance that entails interview skills, resume development, also short-term class training. Those are from 3 to 6 month classrooms, style training for specific job skills or general education. Also long-term classroom training, including continuing education that's through maybe a community college, university, to enhance employability of LMI individuals. Also subsidized employment, public subsidies provided to private sector employer to hire and provide on-the-job training to disadvantaged individuals. So a combination of work and learning has been shown to be the most effective. And as an example, Jefferson County in Kentucky, for example, after assessing their economic development needs, they partnered with a local quasi-public report corporation to form a job development strategy that incorporated all aspects, social, physical, and economic of job training and placement. They used the Section 108 loan to subsidize construction of an industrial park and provided on-site job training, childcare, and even housing assistance to employees of the river port. They also entered into an agreement with the local transit authority to provide public transportation to and from low-mode areas in Jefferson County. So today, that park has over 70 businesses that employ over 4,500 Jefferson County residents. So see how you can combine all these activities and all these areas to a successful program. It is important to draw a distinction between an economic development assistance, that is the training that is eligible as an economic development assistant, and training that is only eligible as public service. To be eligible under 570-203, which is a special economic development activities, the training must be for people who have already been offered a job or who will be offered a job after completion of the training. Summer youth employment programs are not economic development. They are not permanent jobs. Then classes on how to prepare a resume, interview and practice, on how to get and hold a job, for example, and other life skills type of courses are public service. You are not training people for a specific job. This has been a recurring problem that you guys need to be aware of. And the issue is that some of the grantees try to skirt around the 15% public service cap, but the regulations are very clear and the standards are very clear on this issue. Next slide, please. Then we talk about technical assistance to business. And Kia mentioned some of these services, but market data shows that 2 out of 3 businesses fail within the first 3 years. 9 out of 10 restaurants fail also. So many people are not suited to start a business. They lack the money to survive the initial years. They don't have the right experience or the expertise. And there are many multiple reasons, right? So it's safe misery to filter these people out with advice and counseling early on. So for the ones with potential, it improves their chances of success. So technical assistance, like in any area, it also assists on that success. There are many small inventor, thinker people who dream up a brilliant gadget. They want to manufacture, distribute, and service it, but then they have no ability to do so. So what could we do? What could we do? They might hook up with an existing manufacturer and licensed invention without getting into areas that are not experienced. So partnership is an important element that enhances this activity. The 570-203C provision provides for economic development services in connection with activities eligible under the special economic development activities, which include and are not limited to outreach efforts to markets available, screening of applicants, reviewing and underwriting applications for assistance, preparing all necessary agreements, management of assisted activities, and the screening, referral, and placement of applicants for employment opportunities and opportunities generated by CDBG eligible economic development activities, including the cost of providing necessary training for person filling this position. So that's where you can go and get the citation on 570-203C. Next slide, please. So continue with technical assistance. Let me ask a rhetorical question. How does a technical assistance meet a public benefit standard or the public benefit test? We haven't talked about the public benefit test, but we'll see in a moment. If no jobs are created from TA, right? So under CDBG, part of the economic development, always they have to create or they have to meet a public benefit standard. And you'll see later on how. As for micro enterprise assistance, and also to accept micro enterprise assistance, they don't have to meet the public benefit standards. But then activities through the CBDO, which are community-based development organizations, they have to meet the public benefit standards. So on such programs, the CPD reps may want to look more closely into the design of such program and see how they are meeting that public benefit standard. What is the goal of the assistance? Should this have been accomplished through a micro enterprise assistance instead, or carry out within a NRSA, which is the revitalization strategic area? So once again, we have to be careful on using technical assistance to ensure that it's through special economic development activities to ensure that it meets the national objective. Next slide, please. So we mentioned the CBDOs, which are the community-based development organization. So let's talk about the distinction before we go into the actual CBDO, because they are a nonprofit. So let's talk about that distinction between a subrecipient and a CBDO as they relate to the CDBG program. The term, as you probably know, the term subrecipient is defined at 570-500C to mean a public or private nonprofit agency, authority, or organization, or a for-profit entity authorized under 570-2010 to provide micro-enterprise assistance, receiving CDBG funds from the grantee to undertake activities eligible under the CDBG program. So while the type of organizations that qualify as CBDOs generally will meet the above description, the subrecipient definition, as I mentioned, 570-500C, excludes CBDOs unless the CBDO is specifically designated by the grantee to be a recipient for CDBG program purposes. In other words, if they're doing activities under CBDO activity, which is a 204, 570-204, they're not subrecipients. But if the grantee allows them or partner with them to carry out activities as subrecipients, then the application or the definition of subrecipient applies. So the designation of an entity as a subrecipient affects the following. whether any income that may be generated by the CDBG funded activity that is received by the entity is considered to be CDBG funded activity. And these reasons is the ones that has to be are affected by making that decision between a subrecipient and a CBDO. So keep this in mind. So another effect is whether the grantee must enter into a written agreement with the entity containing requirements specified in 570-503. Also, the grantee could elect to enter in such agreement with the CBDO, whether or not it's designated as a subrecipient or not. So that also keep that in mind. Another effect is whether the entity is bound by the general administrative requirements imposed by the CFR 200 in its administration of the CDBG funds to it by provided by the grantee. So as you can see, there's some factors that needs to be considered in order to make that determination or make that decision. But fundamentally, in order to use the authority provided under this category of special activities by CBDOs, the grantee must ensure that 4 key tests are met. So the entity selected qualify as CBDO under 570-204 is they must have the following characteristics. First, is organized under state or local law to engage in community development activities in a specific geographic area within the community, has a primary purpose of improvement, the improvement of the physical, social, economic environment or of its service area by addressing one or more critical problems in that area with particular attention to the needs of the low mod income person. It is a for-profit, if a for-profit organization, the profits to shareholders or members are incidental to its operation. So if it's a for-profit, the main objective is not producing profits. Those profits could be incidental to the activity. The governing body membership consists of 51% of LMI residents of its service area or owners or officers of entity located in that service area. It is not an agency or instrumentality of the grantee, and no more than 1/3 of the board is elected or appointed public officials. So this sounds very familiar, right? With for those grantees or PJs participating jurisdiction on the home, because that's similar to the CHOTOs in the home program. So then continue on with those 4 tests that the project that the CBDO will undertake qualifies under 570-204 A1, 2, and 3. Remember, these activities of the CBDO, they are listed in that provision. Then the last one is that the CBDO will be carrying out the activities as defined at 570-204 A4, and that the CBDO is not carrying out any activity specifically prohibited in 570-207A. So one thing that I want to highlight on the slide before moving on, if your training done, like is mentioned there, is done through a CBDO, it does not count against the public service cap. And CBDO economic development activities do trigger public benefit standards. They have to meet those standards. All right, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what the CBDO activity entails. So possible activities include, but are not limited to, new housing construction, that can be only carried out by the CBDO. You are well aware that with CDBG funds, new construction is prohibited. However, one of the exceptions of that prohibition is when the activity or the new construction is carried out by the CBDO. So another activity is the job training, which, like I mentioned, is not subject to the public service cap. Also, these activities that they carry out, and they are in the neighborhood revitalization strategy area, or the NRSA, that doesn't apply to the, it's not included in the public service cap, as well as they can do other type of economic development activities. So the fact that you're verifying that it is a bona fide CBDO is a big advantage to carry out an activity as another tool, like Kia mentioned at the beginning, which is not an activity, but it's a mechanism, a tool that the grantees have to carry out different type of economic development activities for a community. So next slide, please. So let's talk, moving on to the voluntary underwriting guidelines. I think we can go back one slide. There we go. Awesome. So look at the slide. It said voluntary underwriting guidelines. And let me clear this up real quick. The reg, when you find in the reg 570, it says that those activities are voluntary, right? That you have to do underwriting, the underwriting guidelines voluntarily. However, and you will see, there's an appropriated language that makes it mandatory. So HUD has developed guidelines that are designed to provide the recipient with a framework for financially underwriting and selecting CDBG assisted economic development projects, which are financially viable and will make the most effective use of CDBG funds. But let me ask you this, and once again, rhetorically, because my background is as a recipient. I spent 18 years down at the city level, carrying out home programs and HUD programs, including home, CDBG, all of them, SPD program. And every time people talk to me about underwriting, I thought that was like, I didn't understand what's underwriting. I thought that was something like out there that I needed to be in NASA to understand the underwriting. But then I never realized that underwriting is the assessing of a risk. That's what you're doing when you're underwriting a project. You're assessing that project. You could be underwriting the project for program requirements. You can be underwriting, and this is more likely the case, for financial, as a financial action, right? You will be trying to determine the risk of if you're doing a project, you're assisting the project via grant or via loans, you're assessing how financially feasible or viable that project is. So just keep in mind that when you hear the word underwriting, what you're hearing is assessing the risk. So HUD provides us these guidelines, and they are referred to and are published in Appendix 8 of the 570, the section. So that will be Appendix 8 to Section 570. So the provisions, like I mentioned, on 570-209A, the use of the underwriting guidelines published by HUD is not mandatory. That's what the provision on 57209A says. However, the appropriated language that appears in appropriation that subsequently converts into a law makes it mandatory. And this is what that appropriation language looks like. And I quote, provided further that notwithstanding section 105E1 of the Act, no funds made available under this heading, and we're talking about the CDBG heading, may be provided to a for-profit entity for an economic development project under section 105A17, unless such project has been evaluated and selected in accordance with guidelines required under section E2 of section 105. And those are the ones, those provisions are the ones in Appendix A. And they are, some of them are, the project must be reasonable. The cost of the project has to be reasonable. All sources of financing are committed. Why is this important? You don't want to put money on things that might not are completed. So we have to be careful. We need to have at least commitment letters, or that they're in the process of getting a commitment letter, and be careful. Then CDBG, not that CDBG is not substituted for non-federal funds. The project, once again, has to be financially feasible, and that's where we do the financial underwriting. The return on investment has to be reasonable. The developers do projects, right, motivated by profit, by a good return. So we have to make sure that we are putting enough public assistance, but not to have it unduly rich, to have a developer unduly enriching himself or herself. So that's why we need to consider return on investment reasonable. And the CDBG funds must be distributed on a pro rata basis. And that is to ensure that the risk is distributed among all the sources, right? We don't have to for the program, for the CDBG program, to carry all the risk by going in on a deal as the first source or using it first. So just be careful with that. All right, so next slide, please. So once again, grantees must ensure that the amount of public benefit to be derived from this type of activity, and some others as well, will be appropriate given the amount of CDBG assistance being provided to the activity. So this in a nutshell is what we are looking at, and we can keep in mind as a public benefit. Grantees must ensure that the amount of public benefit to be derived from the activity will be appropriate given the amount of CDBG assistance being provided to the activity. So the CDBG authorizing statute requires that eligible activities must meet standards of public benefits. Specifically, it requires an activity carried out under the category of special economic development activity. And we've been talking about this one because this is all what we've been talking this morning, 57203, or one which could be carried out under the category, but it is instead carried out under the special activity by CBDO. Remember, we mentioned that 203 and CBDOs are the ones that has to meet public benefit standards. So they have to meet the public benefit standards as set forth in 570-09B. So the use of public benefit standards are mandatory for the following activity, and this is like a recap. Special economic development projects, 57203, CBDO projects as applicable under 570-204, and public improvement projects classified under low mod job creation retention with more than $10,000 per job in a CDBG assistant. So if a grantee is carrying out, for example, a commercial rehabilitation of a property owned that is carrying out economic development activities, let's say like a strip mall, for some reason they are the owners and they have this and they're rehabilitating that mall, which is a public facility since it is owned by the grantee. They will have to meet the public benefit standards, even though it's a public service, it's a public facility or publicly owned, but it's carrying out an economic development activities, and they will have to meet the national objective. And once again, the public benefit standards are not applicable to micro enterprise activities under 570-2010 or commercial rehabilitation, like I mentioned before, specifically for the facade and facade improvement programs or code violation activities. So next slide, please. So let's move on to how we calculate the public benefit standards. So there are two options for determining the benefit. One is through jobs created or retained. The jobs must be permanent, full-time equivalents, or FTEs. So now, you can define this and you can combine, for example, you can create 2 or 4 part-time jobs, and that will be considered what? 2 jobs, 2 FTEs, because it has to be full-time equivalent job. So keep that in mind. Another way to determine the benefit is through goods or services provided to LMI persons in that service area. So the service area is determined by the grantee, and we are not going into the detail of how to set up a service area. In the CDBG site, our page, our colleague Robert Pearson provides a great video on how to determine job service area. I encourage everybody to take a look at that, because that's how it should be done. So the actual fund disbursement is not a factor in applying for public benefit standards, either for an individual activity or for a community's economic development activities in the aggregate. Okay. Pursuant to 209B4, the individual activity public benefit standards are to be applied to the number of jobs to be created or retained by the activity. Okay, and it is determined at the time the funds are obligated. So when you're evaluating an economic development activity, at that particular time, you make that determination. And of course, when a business provides you with this information, or you're trying to determine, make sure that the projections, because sometimes when you're talking about creation, depends on many factors. So make sure that those projections are real and are reasonable, all right? Not pie in the sky, right? No. Then under pursuant to 209B2, an entitlement grantee is to apply the aggregate public benefit standard to all applicable activities for which CDBG funds, including by definition Section 108 funds, let me say, are first obligated within each single CDBG program year, without regard of the source year of the funds using for that activity. So just make sure that we understand that for the individual activity, for the individual public benefit standard has to be made at the time that you assist that activity, that business. However, if you take the aggregate, and I think we'll go over that in a little bit. So the individual standard is applied for that particular project at that particular time. Then you have to consider that the aggregate will be at the end of the program year for all economic development activities, including the Section 108. So you have two ways. One that is done for that particular activity, and one like the aggregate word, you're aggregating, putting together all the economic development activities for the program year. At the end of the program year, hopefully you have made the aggregate standard. But that's why at the point that you obligate the money, that's where you have to make the calculation and make sure that you stay with that. And I'll show you why. So all applicable projects must meet the individual test, and the entire program must meet the aggregate test. And that is how you kind of remember individual standard. Oh, that's for individual project. Aggregate test, that's for all economic development projects within the program year. So once again, apply all that time of CDBG obligation and assess upon completion based on the actual achievements. Okay. So see what we have. Let's talk then about let me see. Let's see then the aggregate standard. Next slide, please. Awesome. So let's start with the aggregate standards. The aggregate standards, they create or retain that this is the standard that must be met to create or retain at least one full-time equivalent permanent job per $35,000 of CDBG funds. This could include Section 108, by the way. Or that is if you're meeting the standard through jobs. Or provide goods and services to at least one LMI per person per $350,000 of CDBG. So let's take a closer look at and see if we can internalize in terms of what we're trying to say. So if you're assisting a business and you are providing $70,000 in assistance for economic development activities, in order for that business or for that activity to meet the public benefit standards, they will need to create or retain at least how many? I'll say 2, right? 70 divided by 35, that will be 2. And that means 2 jobs that need to be create or retain. And of course, creation is easy. Retention is a little bit more, require more justification, since like Kia mentioned at the beginning, you have to state that if it's not for the but for rule, if it's not for the CDBG, that job will be lost. So, but those are the 2 things. Or the provided goods or services. Let's say, for example, that you have in a food desert and you are assisting a business to open a grocery store, and you have determined the service area of 1,000 people. So you have to make that determination. You divide the 1,000, the amount of assistance divided by 350, And hopefully that will give you the number less than the number that are in the service area, that are the people that you're going to be serving, the LMI persons that are in that service area, right? If it's more, great, right? That means that the cost of that service is cheaper as the number increase. So those are the two things that need to be that you need to be aware. One thing, and I'll talk about it this during the CV coronavirus slide. The notice published for the CDBG-CV actually waived the aggregate standard. So for CDBG activity, the aggregate standard is waived. Okay, once again, the aggregate standard is waived for CDBG-CV. Keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, applying the aggregate standard, some community have offered incentives to companies at an outrageous level. So, and this is intended to control that, right? Individual standards allow some flexibility, but aggregate standard requires that higher price jobs or services are offset by lower cost jobs or services. So standard apply to all activities obligated in any given CDBG program year. And I'm talking about the aggregate standards, one more. And that the CV notice waive the requirement of the aggregate standard, right? So you don't have to comply with that. There's no aggregate standard on the CDBG-CV. So let's take a look now. Let's go to the next slide. And let's take a closer look at the individual standard. Okay, so activities identified in 209B2 may be excluded from meeting the aggregate standard, but must meet the individual standard. So I said that the CDBG-CV notice waive the aggregate standard. However, the individual standard needs to be met. All right, once again, individual standard has to be met. So, and these are some of the applicable activities that may be excluded from meeting the aggregate standard during a regular CDBG activities. Provide activities that provide jobs exclusively for unemployed persons or participating in one or more of the following activities, like jobs training partnership, job opportunities for basic skill, aid to family with dependent children. Another activity is that provides jobs predominantly for resident of public and Indian housing units. Another one that could provide jobs predominantly for homeless person. Another one provides jobs predominantly for low skill, low and moderate income persons where the business agrees to provide clear opportunity for promotion and economic advances or economic advancement, such as through provisions of training. So this is how you kind of put it together with on the job training. So these are examples like I like to mention. So let's take a closer look at the individual standards per se, and they are that the assistance may not exceed $50,000 per full-time permanent job created or retained, right? So how you determine that? Just the same way. So in order for that business that now he's asking for $100,000 for an economic development activity, he will need to provide you 2 full-time equivalent jobs in order to meet the individual standard. Once again, you take the system, in this case, or example is 100,000, you divide it by 50,000, that will give you 2, and that is 2 jobs. It could be 4 part-time jobs, but then you have to agree, and it will have to be an agreement on how you're going to count those jobs. So that has to be done through an agreement with the business. Or if you're doing services, the system may not exceed $1,000 of expenditure per low mode income person, right? In terms of goods or services. So once again, that's why the service area and that determination of service area is important, right? Because it will give you the base number to determine the public benefit standards, right? That is very important when you get a proposal from a business or you're planning to assist businesses. That service area is important. All right, so I will say we can go to the next slide. Because this will keep us to, or puts you for understanding the CDBG-CV public benefit standards. Okay, so the notice that I mentioned before, the Federal Register notice, waived that requirement, and that the assisted economic development projects are not subject to the aggregate public benefit standards. That is what it does, right? However, and I mentioned, and I was emphatic about it, the individual public benefit standards were waived or were modified to allow the following. So, and we are talking strictly for CDBG-CV. The activity will create or retain at least 1 full-time equivalent job, permanent job, per $85,000 of CDBG assistance, right? So instead of dividing that assistance by 50,000, you will divide it by 85,000. So that allows the understanding that you'll get they'll meet the public benefit standard a lot easier. And that's concerning jobs. But if we're talking about services, then the activity will provide goods or services to residents of an area. And the business, the assisted business amount at least 1 LMI person per 1,700 of CDBG funds used. These are the individual standards for CV activities. The individual, in terms of job, is you cannot assist with more than $85,000 per job created, or services provided is no more than $1,000 or $1,700 per service or per person of those created. So I guess we can move to the next slide. So the assistance was provided due to, if the system was provided due to business disruption related to coronavirus, in which case no monetary standard applies, because HUD has determined that there's a sufficient public benefit derived from the provisions of assistance to stabilize and sustain businesses in the grantee jurisdiction that suffered the disruption due to coronavirus. And that is the reason for waiving the aggregate standard, right there. That is the main justification. So we are meeting the aggregate we are generating enough public benefit already by providing by the PPR, right? Prepare, prevent, and response to the coronavirus. Next slide, please. So now we have a question that you may go below the presentation. You have the Slido there, and this is the poll. And the question: economic development activities assisted with CDBG-CV funds are not subject to the individual public benefit standards. Whoa, that was quick. That was awesome. So the answer, and I think you got it. Everybody, there's no true answer on that poll. So I'm very glad that you got that. Oh, well, some people answer yes, but okay, they're taking it back. So that's good. But the big majority understood that the public benefit standards still apply, even though the aggregate public benefit standards for those activities supported by CDBG-CV are waived. So, or the aggregate is waived. So with that, I'll send it back to Kia, and we are ready, I guess, for some questions.
Right, thank you for that presentation, Jorge. What if the employees are from an employment agency? They are the employee of the agency, or are they considered the company's employee?
What if the employees are from an employment agency? They are not, most in these cases, the employment agencies they're like contractors. They're not actually employees. But in any case, they'll have, if they want to apply for a job, they'll have to come in and do the process, and they will have to be low mod. They have to prove their income levels in order to ensure that it's a low moderate income person.
Okay. The next question is, would the business need to be in a commercial building, or would home-based businesses qualify as well? For instance, an at-home childcare business. We get a lot of questions about at-home businesses in our community.
Right. So in that case, and I think I kind of mentioned what is on the provision of 57202C, or I think it's one of the provisions under commercial rehabilitation, where it's more toward the business, but it can be for people living in their business. So that pretty much could apply to that situation.
Okay. You spoke about the fact that many economic development grantees use LMJ to meet national objectives, but that is not the easiest way to document. Could you expand on that?
Well, I mentioned, for example, when you use CDBG or Section 108 to assist, let's say, a grocery store, because you will be lending the money, and that will be a 203B activity, lending the money to a for-profit in a food desert, right? So you remember, the way you meet the national objective is it could be in various ways. It has to be one, and most of the time is the most easily to document. So if you can establish a service area, which is a food desert, and that you will be providing food, goods or services to LMI, in that case, you could meet the national objective through LMA instead of LMJ. So that could be one way to overcome of the restrictions of creating jobs is to me the public benefit standard, because the public benefit standard deals with the actual jobs and the actual people being serviced, right? That is the main thing. Meeting the national objective has to do with the percentage. For example, you can meet a national objective through LMJ, which means that at least 51% of those jobs created or retained are for low mod income persons. But the public benefit standard talks about specific minimum number that needs to or jobs that need to be created or good or services provided in order to determine the public benefit. So those are the main things. One deals, national objective deals with a percentage, but the public benefit standard requires specific numbers. Just keep that in mind and never conflate those two things.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question about indirect costs. Are indirect costs allowable under micro enterprise activity?
Well, that will be a little bit deeper than this presentation, but I suggest that you go into the 2 CFR 200 and take a closer look if those are the case, and that will be interesting, because we I'm originally from the financial management division here at CPD OBGA, and we deal with indirect costs, and we have personnel that deals with that directly, especially for profits, because we generally see the nonprofits and grantees submitting indirect cost proposals and charging indirect costs, but we rarely see for profits submitting for indirect costs. So the question is, yes, it is done. It is allowed, but in terms of the micro enterprise aspect of it, I don't see anything that really exclude them from getting indirect costs. So just has to look at 2 CFR 200. If not, call Financial Management Division out here at headquarters, and we'll get you the answer.
Thank you. Why use the public service classification for job training if it is subject to a cap, as special economic development activity is not subject to that?
Why the use of public service classification for job training is not subject to a cap as a special economic, because you are creating job. Because that training has to result in creating a job, versus when the public service cap apply, is that you're just doing service to preparing resume generally, and it's not tied to creating a job. That is the main the reason why the service cap applies for when you're not creating or it's not tied to a specific job.
Okay. What is the definition of reasonable?
I knew this was coming. Well, you have to be aware of what's going on in your market, right? What is reasonable in terms of because remember, the developers, they want profits, right? But I mean, what is reasonable? Well, I will say that will depend on the market, what's going on, and there's many standards or benchmarks that are used that can guide you to this reasonable test, right? So remember, the return on investment is the minimum yield or return that a developer is willing or requires in order to go into that specific economic development activity. So, because if, for example, I can say, well, if my return on investment is 5%, I might as well invest that somewhere else, right? So that type of thing, that type of analysis is the one. Usually, I wouldn't say, but it is between 10 and something like that. Just think about the choices that the developer has or investor has to make money, right? Do I put it in this development or do I invest it somewhere else? That is the answer for that one.
Okay. Could enhanced lighting in a downtown core be considered a service benefit to meet national objective for LMI?
So this activity is more likely a public service, a public infrastructure project, and as such, that city has to be LMI, meaning that at least the population is LMI. 51% of the population is LMI. That's the only way. If it's not, it might be difficult to justify a service area for that, because even though the whole city, we'll have to see, but that is a public infrastructure and it will have to be determined through the service area.
Okay. Our CV program goal is to retain LMJ. Is there a need to also document jobs that are not LMJ?
Well, let me rephrase that. Our CV program goal is to retain jobs. And you're meeting the national objective through jobs, LMJ, that's the national objective. Is there a need to also document jobs that are not LMJ? Well, like I mentioned before, in order to determine if you're meeting a national objective, it's a function of the percentage, right? So out of all jobs that are created or retained, at least 51% has to be for LMI. So to answer your question, yes, because you have to take all the jobs that are created or retained and then figure out who went to the LMIs, and you have to document that, and hopefully you'll meet the 51% threshold. So yes, you have to account for all the jobs. However, the ones that you need to document, so that's another thing. The ones that you need to document as LMI are the ones that gonna count toward your national objective.
Okay,
all right.
now, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I'm fine. I'm done with that one.
Okay, this is our final question in the queue. When using LMJ, what % of jobs created or retained need to be filled by LMI individuals? And for how many years do you need to monitor that the created or retained jobs are filled by LMI individuals?
That's a good question. That is very good.
Excellent question.
So we can use probably the next 21 minutes explaining that. Nah, just kidding. So what % of jobs created or retained needs to be filled by LMI? Well, our reason to be CDBG is to assist LMI. So at least 51% of those jobs, of the total of jobs that are created, like I mentioned before, has to go to LMI. And you have to document that they are LMI. And the best way to carry out an activity with your business is through the agreement. That agreement will need to specify the how many jobs are they proposing to create, right? Because when they come to you, they came to you with the proposal, they say, oh, I will create this many jobs. So first of all, you need to underwrite that and make sure that it's reasonable. Secondly, that during that, on that agreement, you're going to specify how he's going to collect the information to justify or to support that the persons getting the jobs or retaining the jobs are LMI. So you might provide the forms, all the information, and the only thing that they need to do is basically fill out the forms, and then the grantee gets back that form and make the determination through their the income limits, right? So, but that has to be put on the agreement. The second part of the question, it is awesome because you're talking about the period of performance, right? So you have to determine that. One caveat is that in a business or for an economic development activities, and where the economy plays a role, and the type of business, you may have a new business that initially gets like a lot of jobs created because it's starting out, but then it will flat out and won't grow anymore, right? So you have to be reasonable in it, in the sense that if it's a new business, and for example, if they're opening up an ice cream shop, and they will create 3 jobs. Well, they're required to create 3 jobs. Usually doesn't take, if he tells you that within 2 or 3 years, he's gonna meet that national objective. Well, that's when you come back and say, okay, are there jobs there? But don't wait like 4 or 5 years for something that is gonna be rapidly creating jobs, and then get on the plateau, because that doesn't make sense. It just depends on the business. So you have to be conscious about it and put it on that agreement, right? And one more thing, because the projections that you determine when you determine the public benefit standards are just that, projection, right? So there's a lot of things that goes into that happens, right? Imagine one example. Imagine the people that submitted the application in November 2019, right? Just before the pandemic. They have good projections, and then the pandemic hit, and we all know already what happened, right? So what happened to those projections? So was that his fault? No, I don't think that was out of his control or her control. So those are the type of things that you need to take into account. But the main thing, once again, use the agreement. At the agreement point is that you put all those things. You have to watch and to meet the documentation requirements when you use CDBG assistance or when you use CDBG funds, just to document those compliance issues. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Jorge. And yes, that is indeed. Okay, maybe not. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today in the economic development session. I hope that you got a lot from it. Jorge and I have both included our emails if there are any additional questions. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the basically CDBG training. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.